one of the things I really appreciated about your book was kind of some of the spiritual practices and formational tools that you kind of lay out. Could you kind of give us a little foretaste of kind of some of those in response to kind of what you were just highlighting there about commissioning us to really see this as our collective work as opposed to segmenting the work?
Yeah, yeah. Um, so I wanted this book to be really accessible. I didn't want any person to read this book and say, okay, but I would need to move, or my church would need to be different, or I would need to have access to these resources in order to do this. And so the last 2/3 of the book, every chapter is a discipleship practice. And I'm assuming that each of these discipleship practices are already taking place in the vast majority of churches and ministries who would read a book like this. And so all I try to do is to reimagine those practices, taking seriously what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus, and taking seriously the impact of this deforming racial discipleship that we all experience. So now how could we reimagine Holy Communion? Some of our churches celebrate weekly, some monthly, but for all of us, communion is central. Communion is the high point of our life together. So how might we think about what communion does to us as a practice, as a liturgical experience? How's it shaping us? And how might we start to imagine its latent potential to form us towards solidarity with the body of Christ? So I wondered, just for example, how many white Christians have ever had the opportunity to receive Holy Communion from a clergy of color? And I think for many of it's kind of sad to say, but I think for many white Christians, they've never had that opportunity. They've never been in a position just to kind of sit under the spiritual authority of a Christian of color and to receive this most sacred sacrament in this kind of very embodied way. And so I try to get into that a little and say, well, how could a church start to think about that and do that? What would it look like for a church to partner with another congregation in their city? And then, because in the New Testament we see that communion often spills over into a feast, how would we maybe think about that as an opportunity to eat together regularly with other Christians who we maybe wouldn't ever spend time together otherwise because of the segregated nature of our culture, of our society? So I try to do that with Holy Communion. I mentioned some of the stuff around children's ministry. I talk about preaching as another one of those things. How can we begin to reimagine preaching? Not asking you to become a different preacher. I'm not asking you to become someone you're not, right? That's not the point. But just that act of preaching, that formational act of preaching. I talk about salvation, like the call to salvation, the altar call, as it were. So many times. I remember being at one of our pastors' conferences, Dominique. I know you were there too. We had this big name a white pastor come, known all over the country, and he talked about his second conversion to justice. And in many ways, like, that's great. I'm really glad he had that second conversion, right? But second conversions are optional. You only need the first conversion. Everything after that is optional. And so what would it look like for us to reimagine even the call to salvation such that white Christians could no longer see the call to justice as being optional, the call to solidarity with the body of Christ as being optional? How would we reimagine that call so that the entirety of what Jesus is inviting us to is relevant, right, and visible right from the beginning, which means that we're also clear of what we're being called away from and what we're repenting of. That chapter might be the most of stretch, right? Because we're talking about repenting of some of these, racial things. But those are the kinds of ways I wanted to reframe this to try to make it accessible. And it's not comprehensive. I hope people will add to that list and in their own context do their own work around this.
Yeah, and I think when you are so particular in naming a target audience for your book, I think it can allow other people to think like it has no fruit for them in their lives. And so I want to counter that and say, as a Black Christian, this has been a book that gave me new insights and new perspectives in regards to what does it mean to reimagine discipleship in a way that orients us towards our neighbor and commissions us into justice in a deeper way. And when you were just even talking about communion and kind of re-envisioning communion, in another one of our immersive discipleship opportunities, immersive discipleship experiences, we actually go down to the border around Tijuana and San Diego, and we get a chance to participate in what's called Border Church. And at Border Church, we have Christians on the U.S. and Mexico border wall do service together, and we get a chance to participate in Holy Communion together across this barrier that's blocking us. And it really commissions you to reimagine what life together looks like in the midst of fortified borders that are intended to segregate and keep us apart. And so I think, you know, this reimagining of participation in the kingdom is critically important. So I really appreciate the ways in which your book pushes all Christians, regardless of race, to kind of reimagine and participate, but still has a particularity to it in regards to what it means for white congregations, particularly in homogenous spaces.
Yeah. And I mean, I think about those people taking communion on the border, right? Every time they receive communion, most likely for the rest of their lives, they're going to remember that, right? Like that act of remembering Christ's body becomes, I would say, what it was intended to be, which is an act of remembering the body of Christ to which they belong as well, right? It holds both of those things in tension in a way that for those of us who live very segregated lives, every time now we receive the body and blood, we go, oh, I'm connected. I'm literally attached with the body of Christ. And so that places certain responsibilities and demands on me of how I live.